Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of this show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker, retired, and proud of it. Today for me, it's August 17th. For you, it's probably the following Thursday, which would be August 21st or 22nd, and or any time for the next month or two. I really appreciate your being here and you're watching. I am my own engineer, although I have help, and I really do appreciate it from the staff of Access Tucson, who've been just wonderful and are great folks. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, today is before the Republican convention, which is toward the end of August, and the Democratic convention, which is the week after. What have I experienced in the last week? Romney, who I have made no secret that I'm not a big fan of Mitt Romney or his tactics, his business tactics, or his personal ethics, which appear to me to be non-existent. Mitt Romney just seems to be the kind of guy who will say anything to get anything, and who will lie through his teeth or misrepresent or change his taxes in order to get his way. So I've talked about that in the past, and Romney alone seemed to be having trouble gaining traction. He's personally not very likable. And so he's now picked a vice presidential pick, ironically, during the Olympics, or right toward the end of them. And his pick is Ryan. Ryan is the author of the Ryan Budget, and he's basically the leader of the Tea Party caucus in the House of Representatives. And in 2010, there was a very, very hard fight between the Republican moderates and the Tea Party. The Tea Party appear to be a disparate group of people with a lot of disparate philosophies. But one general roundabout the philosophy is they appear to be pro laissez-faire and against big government. That seems to be the main thing. Against taxes and against deficits, which is kind of contradictory because in most cases you got to pay taxes in order to avoid deficits. But they believe in the Laffer curve, that the less taxes that are paid by the wealthy, the better the economy is, and that offsets each other. Of course, in reality, that hasn't been proven. There are moments in history when lower taxes creates a stimulus, and the stimulus creates some jobs. However, that's always been very, very short term. And long-term low taxes, the Bush tax cuts is a perfect example, have shaved off growth and eventually created tremendous and incredible deficits. And every single year I do a show where I say if we would jump off the fiscal cliff, every year there's something like it, just let all of the Bush tax cuts expire, we'd be pretty close and on a glide path to getting rid of the deficit every year and going back to surplus. And I've shown many, many charts to that effect and so on and so forth. This last year, back to 2010. 2010, in 2009, a group called Americans for Prosperity organized a very, very big conference in the Palm Springs area, sponsored by the Koch brothers, David Koch and his brother. The Koch brothers are a very, very established, extremely wealthy family. Together, they control about a $50 billion company, which owns most of the pipelines, the oil and gas pipelines in the country, as well as Georgia Pacific Paper and Wood, including lots and lots of forests within the United States, and a number of other companies, coal-fired power plants, and a bunch of other things. So they're the second largest privately owned corporation in the United States. And by privately owned, they are not public. They don't have to declare their financial statements to the SEC. They do have to pay taxes. And they don't like it. They don't like paying taxes. So they have been behind a lot of groups to reduce taxes, the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, a mishmash and an interconnection of scores of different right-wing think tanks that all reflect each other's findings over and over and over again. And they're allied with the Murdoch organizations, News Corp, Fox News Network, and so on and so forth, always has their chosen intellectuals on. So, they've come up with basically an ideological basis, a scientific basis, if you care to think of it. They have their own economists and their own economic theories. And they decided that they needed a grassroots group. So they got together in 2009, promoted a tremendous effort to find candidates, promote those candidates who had the ideals that the Koch brothers agreed to. Now, the name of the organization that was behind this movement, so to speak, was Americans for Prosperity. But there's other names, there's other little organizations that are behind it. The name the Tea Party actually came from a CNBC analyst, a stock analyst, who was angry that the government was going to bail out some homeowners who were underwater and who were in danger of foreclosure, and said that the real people should get together and storm the bastions just like they did with the Tea Party when the colonists in Boston raided an English ship and threw the tea in the harbor, dressed as Native Americans. So that's where this whole Tea Party thing came from. So that got picked up by Americans for Prosperity. And they started the Tea Party Express and the Tea Party Patriots and the Tea Party this and the Tea Party that. And a bunch of right-wing talk show hosts and so on and so forth tried to get ahead of this whole movement and tried to take it over. The most notorious of which was Glenn Beck, who had a rally at the mall, and I noticed everybody was sitting far apart from one another, and claimed that 100,000 people showed up to a Tea Party rally with Glenn Beck. Of course, that was promoted by Fox News, and Glenn Beck worked for Fox News. However, Fox News did not appreciate Glenn Beck, who was a pretty strong, I'd say, strong-minded, let's say, character, taking over the Tea Party and not following the Daily Memo from Fox News, and he was summarily fired. They switched around his times, his ratings went down a little bit, and Fox News found an excuse after he declared himself the titular leader of the Tea Party, which was actually controlled and funded by Americans for Prosperity, the Koch brothers, and some other groups. So what is the ideology here? And this is where Ryan comes in. The Tea Party promoted a bunch of candidates on an off-year election, and they actually ejected a lot of down-the-line conservative but moderate Republicans, and replace them with Tea Party firebrands, so to speak. Take Back America and so on and so forth. However, if you listened inside their groups, they were very fiery. But the ads that they put on, which were cutout ads, the same in every district, with different names, were basically Obamacare is bad because it's cutting Medicare. Which was ironic because the Tea Party philosophy was to privatize Medicare in the first place and privatize Social Security in the second place, and try to get rid of and dismantle as much as possible the welfare state, as they would put it, or the social safety net, as the Democrats would rather it be called. So I've been thinking about this, and I've been thinking about Ryan. Again, they're coming up with the ads saying that Obamacare is cutting Medicare and ignoring what they wanted to do with Medicare. So in 2011, so 2010, the Republicans swept in, took over the House, but some of the Senate candidates that were put in by the Tea Party or Americans for Prosperity were so ridiculous and over the top that they lost sure wins in Nevada, Delaware, where a moderate Republican would have won for sure, was way ahead, and some other states. So the Democrats squeaked in with still a majority in the Senate and the control of the Senate, but the House was swept over by the Tea Party, and the Republicans ended up with a 49-person lead, which means that to be kicked out, the Democrats would have to pick up at least 25 seats. So basically, they have a real lead of 25. But for every seat that a Republican has, a Democrat doesn't have. So really, the impact is 2. But for everyone that's picked up, the impact is 2 as well. So the House went over to the Republican side. The strategy was to have the House and the Senate and to bog down Obama so that he couldn't possibly do anything for the next 2 years and would be unelectable at the end of it. And they had actually declared that so. So the Ryan budget was the Tea Party budget. The 2 things they were going to do was 3 things were shut down the government, refuse to raise the debt ceiling, and to without draconian cuts that the Democrats couldn't stand, and to pass a Ryan budget and force the president to veto it. Well, what was in the Ryan budget? Well, again, there was a little bit of overreach there. Yes, the Republicans had won an off-year election with a low turnout. But they thought that they had a mandate because they had won an entire House of Congress, whereas previously the Democrats had the presidency in both houses and had passed Obamacare, rescued the car industry, and passed a big stimulus. So the Republicans were not only going to do just the opposite of what the Democrats had done, they were actually going to take their agenda and put it into practice. So what was in this agenda? Well, the most glaring part of the agenda was to for Medicare, for people 55 and below, to be turned into a voucher program, so that when somebody who's 55 now in 10 years, or 55 in 2011 in 10 years, so that would be 2021, would become 65, he wouldn't be able to get unlimited coverage for hospitals and doctor visits, which is what Medicare is now. The government itself, HHS, which is extremely efficient, more efficient than the private healthcare providers and insurance companies, with an overhead of about 3%. These Medicare would go by the wayside, would not be issuing your checks and paying your bills. You would get a voucher that you would bring to a private insurance company, and the private insurance company would cover your insurance. The only catch was the voucher was the average amount per Medicare covered person in 2011. So in 2021, the person would get a voucher for $8,000, which is only the average coverage for a person on Medicare. Now, take into account that Medicare is a program for people over 65 and above all the way until death. So about at least half of your medical costs, most likely 2/3 or 3/4, are covered, are actually expended in the couple of years before death. So everybody who makes it to 65 and gets on Medicare is pretty much going to be expending the maximum amount at one point in his life, toward the end of his life. And of course, that covers people with heart problems and that are eventually going to take them down, people with cancers that are eventually going to take them down, people with Alzheimer's, people with all these different things, God forbid, that cause death in the elderly. So all those people have to be covered for $8,000, basically. Well, since $8,000 is the average anyway, already half the people on Medicare are already costing more than that in 2011. And almost all of them would be costing more than that in 2021. So basically, the bottom line of the Ryan plan for Medicare is that you would get a voucher. You'd bring it to your insurance company that probably is going to say that's not enough, even to cover hospitalization and doctor visit insurance, which is Medicare Part A. So the bottom line is you end up with a voucher that's guaranteed not to pay your expenses. And if you're on Social Security, which they wanted to privatize too, but that's another story, or if you're on a fixed income, or you're living off of your savings, basically the Ryan plan would take the elderly and basically put them in a very, very bad position. Basically take their money away from them if they have any money, and put a burden on the middle class, on the working people, to try to cover their parents if they care to cover their parents. So basically, if you're an old person and you present a voucher to the insurance company says $8,000, no, that's $16,000 for you because you're old and you might get sick, and maybe you are sick. The other $8,000, if you don't come up with it, basically you die under a bridge. So the whole program was basically set to, here's a little incentive, this is better than nothing, and if you can't buy your own insurance in front of it, as far as we're concerned, you're welcome to die under a bridge. So that became known in 2011. It's been somewhat forgotten since then, and was incredibly unpopular. Republicans didn't like it by over a majority, but independents hated it, 60 to 70%. Democrats, of course, were against it, and the American people as a whole were against it, at least 58%, and in other polls, 66 or 67%. Ryan became a dirty word for like a few months, but there was another crisis that overtook it soon enough, which was the debt ceiling, which made the Republican Congress even more unpopular. So you have a situation which is very, very weird. You have a situation now where Romney, with all of his faults, but his perceived moderation, has 45% popularity, 40% which are just plain Republicans, and 5% which are right-leaning independents or libertarians. And the Republican Congress has a popularity of 12%. And the symbol of that Congress is Representative Ryan, who is now the vice presidential candidate. Well, what does Ryan have going for it? He's handsome. He's blue-eyed. He's muscular. He's erudite. If you talk to him, he has great things to say. But rather than, he wanted to go in there and say, you know, Medicare is bankrupt and I'm going to have to go and take it away from you guys and replace it with a voucher program. And here's why, and you really ought to like it. But Romney's basically put a duct tape over his mouth. And now it's the same thing as in 2010, but before people even knew what the Republican program was. And in 2010, it was Obamacare is cutting Medicare in the future. You know, they said 2010 $500 billion. Now they claim it's $700 billion, which is $70 billion a year. What they aren't mentioning is that the Ryan plan also cuts the same $70 billion a year, but it doesn't cover what it did before because they put you on a voucher program on top of it. Whereas the Obama's system does cut the 70 billion or 50 billion. It's hard to say what because different numbers are rattling around. But that is in the future growth of costs, and those are cuts in the payments to the insurance companies, which is Medicare Part B, and to the pharmaceutical companies, especially, which set up Medicare Part D, which is the drug benefit that Bush passed during Bush, which wasn't funded and which didn't allow the government to negotiate in any way with the pharmaceutical companies. So basically, was overcharged from the word go. It ended up not being as overcharged as people thought because the insurance companies went back to the pharmaceuticals companies and said, we're going to drop you if you don't cut your price a little bit, rather than charge basically the Canadian price, which is negotiated by their national health insurance. So basically, the bottom line was, yes, there are cuts for increases of cost in the future in return for having a Medicare that pays all your doctor and hospital visits versus the Ryan plan, which is we're going to make the same cuts and then we're going to give you a voucher and the insurance companies are going to tell you to take a jump and you can die under a bridge, which saves even more money. Isn't that great? So that's the bottom line on that. So it came to me, what could be the philosophy that would say, and even to the self-delusion of the 2010 Republican Congress, that would say, let us just take all these seniors and dump them out of Medicare and give them a voucher. So, and there's been other things. Tea Party candidate for the senatorial position in Missouri, who just won the primary there. He's saying we have to get rid of student lunches, lunches for school kids, a school lunch program. But what comes down? What is the source of this? And the source is from two different sources. One is the Koch brothers' father, and his name was Fred Koch, and he's one of the founders of the John Birch Society. And the John Birch Society felt that any social welfare program was collectivism, and they were against collectivism in general. And they felt that not only were we fighting a Cold War at the time, this is the 1940s and 50s and 60s, but on top of that, we were fighting an internal war against collectivism. And anybody who wanted to help anybody, food stamps, Great Society, Medicare, and so on and so forth, child labor laws, the idea of kids not working, minimum wage, anything like that was a threat to America because it was a collectivism, and collectivism is basically the philosophy of communism. So that's where that came from. And the other one came from Ayn Rand, who was actually a secularist, in fact, an atheist, but who had a very complex and interesting philosophy. But part of that philosophy was the pursuit of happiness is the greatest good, and anything that's against capitalism is bad for it. Thank you.